Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sally, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Anne Gray Fischer, discussing her book, The Streets Belong to Us: Sex, Race, and Police Power from Segregation to Gentrification. She is joined in conversation today by Treva B. Lindsey. Today's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum series, which takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Though we remain digital for the time being, we have a full schedule of virtual events in the coming weeks as part of this afternoon series and others. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display. This is where you can submit all of your questions, and we'll get through as many as time allows. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked CC or live transcript on your display and click through the options. If you go to the chat function of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of The Streets Belong to Us. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and the brilliant scholarship this series showcases. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Anne Gray Fischer is an assistant professor of gender history at the University of Texas at Dallas. As a historian of the 20th century United States, her research and teaching explores histories of gender, sexuality, and race, law enforcement and the state, and feminist activisms in the modern United States. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of American History and the Journal of Social History, as well as the Washington Post, the Boston Review, and elsewhere. Today, she is joined in conversation by Treva B. Lindsey, an associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies, and the founder of the Transformative Black Feminisms Initiative at Ohio State University. She was the inaugural Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard in 2016. This afternoon, our panelists have joined us for a discussion of Anne's book, The Streets Belong to Us: A Searing History of Women and Police in the Modern United States. Men, especially Black men, often stand in as the ultimate symbol of the mass incarceration crisis in the United States. Women are treated as marginal, if not overlooked altogether, in histories of the criminal legal system. By illuminating both the racial dimension of sexual liberalism and the gender dimension of policing in Black neighborhoods, The Streets Belong to Us illustrates the decisive role that race, gender, and sexuality played in the construction of urban police regimes. I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Anne and Treva.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's so good to see you here and get a chance to talk with you about this very, very exciting and important book. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much, Treva. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you.
Awesome. So why don't we jump right in so we can make sure we get some questions in from the audience. I have a whole list of questions as I was reading through and thinking about this. Now, something you introduced very early on, and this is in the introduction to the book, and it's just the framing, and it's simple, and it may seem common knowledge, but in certain ways, I think the way you frame it and how you go through and really dissect it in the book matters deeply, that women matter in the history of police power. And this framing of kind of gendered criminality in one hand, but also how we think about the authority that we assign to policing, we expect from policing, and we engage from policing. With that framing, can you give us a little kind of introduction to the book and how you're thinking about women in particular mattering in the context of how we understand policing in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for that question, because I think it really gets to sort of a fundamental question of who has the right to exist on city streets, right? And women in particular public space has been historically organized with full rights and access for white men, right? And women have a long legacy of not having rights to that public space, particularly because the public woman is sort of long and has a deep legacy of sexual profiling, prostitution, right? Women on city streets have been so historically marked as sexual deviants. And so the question starts with just who has the right to city space, because women's bodies are not neutral in public space. Their social location might be different, right? If we're thinking about white women in city space versus Black women, and as well as, poor white women and poor Black women in city space, even have different claims and different access to simply being able to exist. And sexual policing has become a key site of social control and identifying who can exist on city streets and who can't, right? Sexual policing itself, through law enforcement, police officers are able to adjudicate, to sort out that complex history of the public woman and identify, right, who is marked as legal, right, or normal, and who is marked as degraded, deviant, illegal, right? And so I started with the project because sexual policing is such a powerful site of social and legal control, and asking the questions, right, of who has had access to the right to exist over time and who has not, right, particularly across the 20th century in the US, opens up these questions, and sexual policing kind of illuminates, right, showcases who simply has the right to exist on city streets.
Yeah, that's so great. And it's also naturally, because I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about sexual policing as a concept. I think when I first heard it and when I first thought about the term, obviously before reading your brilliant book, was thinking almost exclusively around sex work and prostitution. But I think there's a broader framing of how you're identifying sexual policing and really outlining it through these different historical moments. So could you give us some scaffolding for that particular framing of sexual policing?
Yeah, absolutely. So sexual policing itself is often seen as kind of a marginal corner of law enforcement, right? It's either dismissed as something that's just always been there, right? Or supported as a protective function of law enforcement to keep women safe, to keep families, communities, and cities safe, right? But in fact, sexual policing is not about enforcing laws against commercial sex. Sexual policing is governance by other means, right? Sexual policing is always doing political work, starting with that like foundational point of who can exist on city streets. And so when we talk about, so by centering sexual policing, we can not only see the crucial ways in which gender informs police logics and police practices, but we can also see how it's so generative of police authority itself, right? The protective feature, the protective function, the ostensible protective function actually conceals the everyday police violence that is perpetrated when police surveil and target and apprehend people who are presumed to be engaging in sexual commercial sex, right? So it conceals the violence under the cover of protective police work, but it also generates so much power by justifying police authority over people's bodies. It produces and generates, sexual policing produces and generates and enforces ideas about womanhood itself, right? Black and white womanhood produced in contrast, right? With white womanhood being sort of held up as the lawful or legal standard of legal womanhood, right? White womanhood itself, and that has changed over time, right? Which white women are considered legal, has changed over time. And those changing ideas about what constitutes lawful womanhood produces these ideas about gendered whiteness and Blackness. That's super important for understanding how police generate their own authority while also producing racist and sexist ideas about womanhood and who belongs. And finally, right? Sexual policing does really material work in cities for developing and generating and enforcing spatial configurations, whether it's segregating Black folks to neighborhoods, right, to Jim Crow neighborhoods in the early part of the 20th century, whether it's about enforcing the mass clearance of humans from city streets in order to increase the capital and increase capital investment and increase capital takeover of cities of historically Black and working class neighborhoods, right? Gentrification. Sexual policing is always at the core to generate this police power, both to shape city space, to produce sexist and racist ideas about womanhood, and finally, simply to adjudicate who has the right to exist.
Yeah, that right to exist, that right to mattering, that right to space, and public space, right? The public and the private, the constructions of that here are so robust. I want to take a step back into thinking, moving into your book, that what was the kind of catalytic moment for this project for you? What prompted you to dig into sexual policing, think about these connections between publics and space, and the kind of guiding core ideas of your project? Because I was thinking of some of the work and some of the scholars that you're engaging, from more contemporary folks like Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie and Kimberly Crenshaw, to sort of gender historians like Sarah Haley, and thinking about this. What was that question for you as you approached this book, or the set of questions that sparked this?
Yeah, so this book is 15 years ago this year. I was working at a labor union local, and I saw on my boss's wall a framed poster for Puma, the Prostitutes Union of Massachusetts. It was, and actually, I'm very pleased to name this. It's on my wall now. So this Puma poster was advertising a hooker's ball, a fundraiser for their organizing in the 1970s. And I was fascinated by the concept of criminalized women organizing for their for legal rights, for better working conditions, for better living conditions, right? And I didn't know at the time that Puma was part of this national movement for what was called at the time prostitutes' rights, but now we call sex workers' rights. And so I was really fascinated with that history of organizing. And Mindy Shadowvert, who is actually here today, wrote a brilliant book on this history of the sex workers' rights movement, Sex Workers Unite. And so that work has been done. And when I went to grad school with essentially the questions of a sex worker movement history, I was in the archives, right, when when George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Martin. I was in the archives when Eric Garner was murdered by police. I was in the archives when Michael Brown was murdered. And so when I stepped back to center the experiences of sex workers and people profiled as sex workers, what I saw was that they all shared a vulnerability and an exposure to police violence. And within the context, right, and by the time I was doing my exams in grad school, Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum had coined the phrase "say her name," right? And so I was thinking about the vulnerability and the exposure of sex workers to police violence. I was also thinking about the invisibility of Black women in these in the uprisings, right, against police violence. And so the really catalyzing question, which was informed by so much of the Black feminist thought that I was working on, I'm so inspired by Patricia Hill Collins, Horton Spillers, Evelyn Hammonds, and thinking about the ways in particular that white womanhood is so generative, right? And the enforcement of white womanhood is so necessary, right? To create contrast, to make womanhood meaningful, right? Womanhood is only meaningful when there's racial contrast, or what we would call racist contrast, right? And so the catalyzing question, right, for me was, how are women made vulnerable to sexual policing? And how is that necessarily, and how are different women, right, with unique social locations, how do we understand the different but interconnected ways in which white and Black women are policed over time, the way their bodies and presumed sexual practices are policed over time, and what work does that do for police?
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's wonderful to think about where we were when we were in the archives as historians, right? And how that shifts and changes your work. And like that moment from like 2012 through 2015 really set, I think a lot of us who were in the archives, our work, who were already looking at some of these ideas and concepts, but deepening them and connecting to that. But I love that the kind of catalytic moment even prior to that was looking at the history of organizing among sex workers. So often when we're looking at these histories, we're not seeing, you note in the book, right, you reference Kelly Hernandez as the idea of the rebel archive that you discuss in the book, that finding those moments of resistance and struggles that then point you towards or point you back towards the conditions under which those struggles become necessary. I found that so lovely and interwoven throughout your book of how you were thinking through that. I want to take us deeper into this conversation around racialized womanhood, particularly because it plays such a large role in the framing of sexual policing and more pointedly, these various significant shifts in terms of public space that often not thought about through the lens of the constructions of womanhood, and more importantly, of racialized and racist womanhood. And so can you walk us through some of the ways that you're thinking through this concept and what it has meant at these different key historical moments, starting from like the progressive era and moving into more recent moments of, targeted mass incarceration, that span of what those racializations have meant and those shifting meanings over that period of time?
Yeah, I was really struggling with a cognitive dissonance when I was in the archive, because I was surrounded, right, and completely absorbed by what was happening outside the archive with, the launching of Black Lives Matter, right, and the overwhelming disproportion of Black people, Black women who are vulnerable to police violence. And yet when I was in the archives, there were just tons of white women. I was not expecting that, particularly in the earlier period. And I think for police historians especially, there's just a grim and relentless sameness to police violence. Scenes of violence that we witnessed in the archive in the 1920s look, eerily familiar to us in 2022. And so I really was committed to identifying what had changed over time, particularly with sexual policing, right, and narratives of prostitution as being the oldest profession and things like that. It's sort of dismissed as always has been, always will be. And that's unacceptable to me, right? Especially when we're talking about police violence. And so it was really important to me that I identified what had changed. And right away, right, seeing all these white women in the archives signaled to me that something had changed, something really important had changed over the 20th century. Going back to that earlier period, right? So maybe the first 3 decades of the 20th century, from the progressive era to the interwar period, right, before World War II, there was a major emphasis on and an alarm around the sexual delinquency of white women. Right now, predominantly white moral reformers were obsessed with this problem, and they were primarily concerned about white women because, right, going back to the Black feminist insights that we've learned and talked about, white womanhood is sort of this cornerstone of the white patriarchal home. Domesticity and motherhood is sort of the valorized work, right, of white women, unpaid work of white women, right? Whereas Black women, right, were necessarily definitionally contrasted, right, as as not capable of morality, right, or as degraded. Their motherhood, their kin relationships were degraded in service instead to laboring and domestic work for white families.
Right.
And so the obsession was about restoring white women to their sort of rightful or assigned role as domestic dependents and moral sort of authorities in the home. What was happening in this period, right? And I was trying to understand, and the Black press was so valuable for this as well. Speaking of the Rebel Archive, right? The Black press was reporting in the early 20th century on the political work of sexual policing in a way that white newspapers were not, right? So in this earlier period, white womanhood is the major cause for alarm, and there's so much activation of policing. There's a huge buildup of carceral infrastructure in this period of probation, parole officers. Laws for sexual policing were dramatically broadened during this period to basically enable police to target and apprehend any woman suspected of engaging in non-marital straight sex.
Right.
And as well as carceral buildups, reformatory institutions, and other kinds of incarceration. And so and this was all sort of in the name of pure white womanhood, right? And restoring pure moral white womanhood. What was happening to Black women in this period? They were absolutely disproportionately targeted by police. Their presumed sexual deviance was naturalized as sort of a feature of the urban sexual landscape. And so while they were disproportionately, of course, still vulnerable to sexual policing, they were more likely to experience what I call in the book violent neglect. Violent neglect is inspired by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's concept of organized abandonment. And it was also the concept of violent neglect, and this is kind of jumping ahead, was also inspired by the activists that I was researching and reading about in the 1980s, in the late 1970s and 1980s, protesting serial murders of Black women in the later part of the 20th century. What they taught me, and what I then saw when I, with that lesson in mind, how I understood what was happening to the violent neglect of Black women in neighborhoods, in Black neighborhoods in the early 20th century, was that police might disproportionately target Black women for presumed sexual deviance, but they would be just as likely to ignore or not tune into presumed commercial sex, presumed sexual practices of Black women, because it was simply accepted as natural and normal due to the overwhelming sort of racist ideologies of sexual normativity at the time. Violent neglect, however, and this is true across the 20th century, but it changes in severity and disproportion over time. Violent neglect made Black women, the violent neglect of police made Black women, compounded their vulnerability to non-state violence and to state violence. So from the earlier period, I just have one example of Ike and Eva Bolden, right? So this Black family in Pittsburgh in the early 1930s, so just on the tail end of Prohibition, a group of 5 white men invaded their home, claiming that they were looking for a brothel, right? And this is acceptable and made possible by policing, both establishing Black neighborhoods as sites of sexual deviance, as sort of natural sites of Black sexual deviance, and it's also made possible by police actively ignoring, right, or looking away or profiting from the relocation of so-called vice to Black neighborhoods. So these 5 white men invade the home of Ike and Eva Bolden in the name of looking for a brothel. Eva Bolden is terrified by this home invasion, fights back, right, against these men who have broken into her home. And she and her husband are then the ones who are arrested, right, for assault and battery, right? And so this is a key way in which the police enforcement of sex laws, right, or the non-enforcement of sex laws in Black neighborhoods produced white terror and additional criminalization and violence, right, in the lives of Ike and Eva Bolden, right? And so it's through the violent neglect, right? And what the activists in the later period would say is that because police identify sexually profiled women as a social problem, or in the language of these activists at the time, because police hunt sex workers, that sends a signal, a green light to others that that violence against sexually profiled people is acceptable and supported by law enforcement. I mean, we're on the 1-year anniversary of the massacre of Asian women working in spas in Atlanta, right? Sexually profiled, the racist and sexist logics of Asian women in massage spas produced, right, ideas about sex workers and about Asian women who may or may not be engaging in sex work, right, that legitimized violence against them. And it's through the sex laws themselves, right, that generates this idea that generated this racist, sexist definition of Asian womanhood in a particular social location, right? So it's another way in which the violent neglect, both through active enforcement and active non-enforcement of sex laws, makes women vulnerable to compounded non-state violence and state violence.
Wow. Yes. I'm just like, yes, I'm nodding in deep approval. And thank you for making that connection as we are, just a year past the attack on the massage parlor. And again, thinking about racialized womanhood and how these racist, sexist ideas and logics compound in both state, intimate, interpersonal, and communal forms of violence that emerged, that in many ways sanctioned, even if there was outrage in response to it, there's a way that logic is so deeply ingrained and interwoven into the fabric of society. And I also thought, when I was reading the story about hearing the Boldens, of thinking about Breonna Taylor and her partner being asleep in the home, hearing that he's initially charged in the murder because he fires back in self-defense, and obviously she is killed as part of this. And an earlier example of that, Ayanna Stanley Jones, who's killed on a failed raid for policing for drugs, right? That there's this notion of drugs, and again, various forms of criminality that are presumptive in these places, and the raiding of private spaces to fix the public good. That's through that, and how Black women and girls become damaged in that, and are both neglected, as you know, in the narrative, how we talk about policing, but also literally violently neglected. That framing is really helpful.
And I think it's, sorry.
No, please.
What I'm thinking of hearing you, right, is that another key point in the book, right, that sexual policing illuminates is the ways in which Black homes do not get the same sanctity, right, as white homes. Yes. We see this, I focus on this in particular in my chapter on World War II, yes. But Sarah Haley has also taught us and talked a lot about the ways in which, through the legitimacy and through the authorization of policing, and in particular sexual policing, we see how it's not even about public space. It's not only about the rights to public space, it's also about the rights to a sanctified home, right? Which is totally, degraded, right, through sexual policing. We see so many examples of law enforcement invading, right, women's homes if they are profiled or presumed to be engaging in commercial sex.
Yes, no, the home is such a particular site for violence, police violence against Black women. So many contemporary examples. and political theorist Shatima Threadcraft thinks through this of the intimate and thinking about what it means that it happens. And perhaps because the home is not this spectacular site where there are, now we have this viral footage of what happens, right? We're relying on the accounts often of officers of what occurred in the home space, but that incursion that things about Ayanna or Deborah Danner or Eleanor Bumpers or these various examples where we see that. But thinking about that through the lens of sexual policing, I think it's such a distinct and powerful intervention here of where we imagine those spaces to be. Your book also does this really rich reframing of how we understand the urban uprisings of the 1960s. It made me think a little bit about Daniel McGuire's work and kind of how we rethink the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, through thinking about Black women responding to the lack of access to bodily integrity. So there's not just that where you sit on a bus that prompts Rosa Parks, but rather the sexual assault that they're enduring, the physical attacks on their body, that these women are also protesting as part of this in the longer history of anti-rape activism that intimately ties into this, that you offer up this kind of policing as a catalyst for the kind of racial inequality of sexual policing of the 1960s. And I wonder if you give us a little insight about that. I just found that intervention to be so compelling, of that kind of recasting of understanding those uprisings through the lens of sexual policing and these racialized configurations of womanhood and space.
Yeah, and this gets back to the earlier question about what changed, like what has changed in sexual policing and why is it important to understand what happened, right? So there was this moment, right, where white womanhood was sort of the cause for alarm. After World War II, and there's a historical contradiction. There's a puzzle that we see across the 20th century where, since World War II, if not before, sex laws have been liberalized, right? It's no longer illegal for a woman to engage in intraracial sex with a man that she's not married to, right? To engage in straight sex with a man she's not married to. This is something that women, in particular white women, were arrested for routinely prior to World War II. Mm-hmm. And sex laws have dramatically liberalized across the second half of the 20th century. And yet at the same time, right, even as the state is steadily retreating from regulating non-marital straight sex, and even even including normative sexuality and normative sexual practices through the decriminalization of same-sex sex or marriage equality, right? So we see this liberalization happening across the 20th century. And yet at the same time, right, we see this systematic buildup of mass policing, particularly mass misdemeanor policing, which is disproportionately and systematically targeting Black women. So what is, how do we understand that as laws have liberalized over time, that in fact more and more Black women are being subject to targeting, right, sexual policing, harassment and arrest? Mm-hmm. One thing that so what I saw in the archives was that white womanhood was gradually decriminalized, right? So the liberalization of sex laws disproportionately benefited white women, even as at the same time we're in this urban moment where police, business leaders, politicians are all searching for ways to recapitalize value in cities that are economically struggling, particularly as more and more as white folks and white capital are fleeing cities in the decades after World War II, right? And so, so the emphasis, the alarm, right, shifts from white womanhood to Black womanhood as sort of a barrier to economic growth, as sort of the ultimate symbol of economic failure, right? and police become the solution to this problem, and they present themselves as the solution to urban problems by targeting, right, and naming and centering Black womanhood and sexual crime. The idea of sexual criminality, which is itself a totally constructed fiction, but they identify Black womanhood as sort of the symbol of the problem that needs to be solved through policing. In the 60s, in this moment that you're talking about, this is when that shift was most visible, particularly to Black communities, even though Black people had absolutely noticed that there was a huge inequity between how white women were being policed and how Black women were being sexually policed. This moment in the early 1960s, in particular, when sex laws are liberalizing at the same moment that more and more Black women are being targeted, was super visible to Black folks in their communities. And it became a key reason for a lot of uprisings against police violence in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Washington, DC. So we see how in this moment, Black communities are recognizing the stark inequities that are widening between how white women's bodies are being policed and how Black women's bodies are being policed in that moment.
Powerful. Such a wonderful kind of recasting and a different entry point into that era of thinking about policing. And your book, as it moves forward, also brings us into, since we kind of move forward in time, of what I think of when I was reading about a kind of a new history of gentrification and a new history of how we understand broken windows policing and how that is connected to kind of sexual liberalization, as you just were hinting towards or gesturing towards in response to the last question of how we understand gentrification in relationship to sexual policing, right? We tend to think of gentrification as displacement of communities and families, right? That's one framing. Broken windows policing, broadly talked about, and even targeted mass incarceration, as you mentioned earlier, it's often thought about as particularly aggrieving Black men and boys, cisgender Black men and boys, men and boys of color primarily, but not necessarily thinking about that kind of policing and its distinct impact on racially minoritized women and girls, undocumented women and girls, and what that means in terms of the structuring in a kind of post-segregation moment and a post-Jim Crow moment, despite obviously racial segregation still thriving in various ways in 2022, but in that de facto versus this kind of legalized way. What made you make those? Some of it seemed the connections unfolded for you as a historian, but I'm curious about how you're placing this and perhaps giving us insight into this notion of gentrification, broken windows policing, and sexual liberalization being these kind of interdependent structuring forces in the ways that we understand the criminalization of Black women and girls as we move beyond the 60s and into the current moment.
Yeah, so I just want to offer some statistics to start us with where we are now, right? Because I think that folks might, I am continually shocked, and there's that for historians of state violence, right? We're always not surprised, but always shocked, nevertheless, and horrified, right? So earlier in the FBI starts collecting arrest data in the 1930s. And arrest data is an imperfect measure of police practices, but the archive is so silenced, the archive is so fragmented that, I find arrest data to be a useful as a measure, as an index of what police are doing, right, of police practices. And when we start, in the 1930s, when the FBI starts releasing their data, white women are overwhelmingly and the largest disproportion of prostitution-related misdemeanors, right? The arrests are overwhelmingly white women. Today, 42% of people arrested on prostitution-related misdemeanors are Black. To put that in context, That is the highest proportion, the highest racial proportion of arrests for any misdemeanor. Drug violations, 26% of Black people are arrested, right? So 42%, nearly double. And that's the top three. So this is the highest proportion of, the highest racist proportion of arrests for prostitution-related misdemeanors, only after murder and robbery. Right. So the disproportion for sexual policing in particular is so stark. And I think that folks don't really think about that as much, because the arrest numbers are the actual numbers of how many people are arrested is actually lower. Right. But we have to think about this intense and stark disproportion of Black people being arrested on these charges. And when I think of that figure, when I see it, even now, when I walk through, when I walk through a city and see gentrification, I know that that is work that is that both erases the presence of sexually profiled Black women in public space, but is also built on their bodies. The violence of luxury condos, right? The violence of gentrification was driven through sexual policing. So broken windows policing and gentrification were absolutely developed hand in hand. You can, in the archives, you have business leaders, right? Politicians and law enforcement coming together in unprecedented ways to enforce mass clearance, to enforce sex laws in service to the mass clearance of humans, in particular Black women, who were overwhelmingly marked as sex workers from the 60s on, in order to recapitalize, to lure white capital investment back to cities that are economically struggling after World War II, the so-called urban crisis moment. But this is not, it's often called an urban crisis, right? Because white people are fleeing, the middle class tax base is dwindling, right? And capital is fleeing cities because they're presumed to be too Black. And Black women in particular were identified as the key barrier to economic recovery. And they were also the sexual policing of Black women's bodies explicitly in this moment was used as an experiment to expand police authority, particularly after 1972, when status policing, just policing people based on how they look, was ruled unconstitutional. So after that moment, it was through sexual policing that law enforcement and their business and political allies identified strategies to resurrect status policing, to resurrect their power to arrest anyone that they see. And this was done through, and to increase, right, the volume of misdemeanor arrests with the explicit goal of preparing cities for capital investment. And so broken windows policing and gentrification were absolutely developed hand in hand, and Black women were the stated targets, right, of the early experiments to make this kind of policing possible. I could go on and on in the legal weeds, and Anna Levosky has also done has shown us how sexual policing was the key site to consolidate the legal authority of police to engage in status policing. But I will, if folks want to go into the Q&A, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We could have this conversation all day, but I definitely want to get to some of these questions. We have 3 in here now, which will probably take us perhaps to the end of our time, but they're 3 fantastic questions. So thank you to the attendees who've posed them thus far. So first attendee asked us, could you talk a little bit more about the archive, a place that is sometimes thought of as a place of inaction? As we continue, as we always do, to ask ourselves critical questions about how we got here, do you think the archive will start to play more of a role in grander public scholarship?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you so much. And I also just want to thank everyone who's here today. I'm seeing a lot of colleagues, comrades. I'm so grateful for y'all showing up today. So I think the archive, I came to this project, my goal, right? Even though I was originally thinking, I started by centering the experiences of sex workers and people vulnerable to sexual profiling, right? Sex workers are people policed as such, and their experiences of law enforcement. But as I moved on in the project, I became very committed to exposing police practices, right? I became very committed to exposing the logic that structured police, how they justified their own authority, how they consolidated their power across the 20th century. Because that's another key site of change, right? Is that the police developed enormous power, right? Much, I mean, in the earlier part of the 20th century, police were a national joke, like held up by even one author of a federal report. Law enforcement was a national joke, right? And now, today, police are seen as sort of the ultimate solution to urban safety, right? Which is kind of grotesque, given the necessarily violent work they do. So I was committed to exposing police practices. So the archive then, appears in a few different forms, and I engage with it in a few different forms. First, we have sort of the gorgeous rebel archive of women like the leaders of Puma, who opened up their garages and filing cabinets to me very early on when I was doing this research, right? The archives of folks who knew that what they were doing was historically important, even if nobody at the time did. Right, so there's that rebel archive, particularly of sex workers, sex work organizers, and allies. And that is definitely a living archive, and one that I think is so important for public facing work, right? Yes. The second archive, right, is the archive of the state, and that is also that must be made public and transparent, but is so often not, right? The state will either actively destroy the records. So Kelly Hernandez is working really hard now on through her awesome new project, right, to make LAPD records widely available. Right. But one of the key barriers, one of the key obstacles I encountered in the project was finding the state records of policing itself, right? Policing conceals itself. And also through the violent neglect of police archives themselves, right? You know, one really key set of probation records was marked for destruction. I only was able to access it simply because the state forgot to do the destroying, right? So there's so many ways in which the state will restrict access to its archives, destroy the archives, or simply forget that they have them at all. Right. And so I think that the public, to the question too about, you know, how is the archive active? So much, I think, in both the Rebel Archive and the State Archive, I access these materials through relationships, right? So the archive is not only alive, it's made alive through the social relationships that we build with each other, with other archivists, with community organizations, with neighbors, right? And because so many of the Puma leaders were my neighbors. So simply being in community and building relationships with folks who care and are asking the same questions actually brings the archive to life, I think, in really powerful and important ways that need to be broadly circulated.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, attendee. I'm going to kind of combine two questions so I can try and get through. We can try and get through the remaining few questions. So one attendee was asking us if you could talk a bit more about the sexual policing you found that goes back to the Great Depression. And we know that there's a history of volatile policing that is centuries old, but wanting to hear a little bit more about this earlier moment. And I wanted to combine that with this question about the continuities that we see in the ways, in particular, Black women's bodies, since that's such a intimate focus in your book have been sexually policed historically, as well as other women of color. And they want to know if you've seen Asian American and Latino women who were policed in similar ways, for example. So that kind of historical specificity of that kind of Great Depression era, and also thinking about this longer history of Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color being policed, if you see some similarities between these two.
Yeah, so I will start with, so, sexual policing takes many forms, and there's different, sort of triggers for police, or sort of that like gets their antennae going. So, right, in the earlier period, especially, white women with men of color was going to be a major, and this means white women with men of Asian descent, Black men, and also Latino men. These are all going to be, police will necessarily assume that laws, commercial sex laws have been violated, or sex laws have been violated when women cross the color line, and when white women cross the color line. So that's a key, particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century, that was a key way in which sexual policing enforced segregation, social segregation, right? By hotly policing and enforcing segregation in white women's own socialization and social relationships. And after that, right, sexual policing is, police are the most common complainant for the police, are the ones who are going to be most likely to press any laws against sexual policing, which makes, or just sexual commercial sex, which makes it uniquely a police-driven practice, unlike other forms of policing, right, against, so-called crimes against property, crimes against the person, crimes against social order are police-driven, and police do not typically witness any, transactional exchange. It's always based on how women look. Right. And when I say women, particularly in a contemporary context, that's fully inclusive of all people who identify as women. And so while to a certain extent, interracial socialization is not as actively policed as it was in the earlier period, racist and sexist logic still completely play into law enforcement logic of who is normal and legal and who is not, based purely on looks and urban location and space.
Right.
Anti-Blackness, gendered anti-Blackness structures so much of law enforcement logic. And I think that's rooted in an earlier period when criminologists, law enforcement authorities, and reformers themselves were thinking in black and white, like thinking very literally in black and white. And so that shapes the range of possibility. It shapes the horizon of possibility for many other women of color, right? Including Latine or Asian, Indigenous women. And let me just quickly go back to that question. Was it
I think this is part of Aaron Smith's question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aaron. Right. And so I think that the similarities are absolutely shaped by gendered anti-Blackness and how that shapes the realm of possibility for so many women. But I think that the histories are so important to attend to, particularly, for example, thinking about Asian women, right? The first immigration restriction law targeting an entire group of people, the Page Act in 1875, was targeting sexually profiled Chinese women of Chinese descent, right? And so there's a very distinct history, and these histories, right, that trace that, say, 1875 moment for women of Chinese origin, those histories across the 20th century absolutely need to be told, because by focusing on Black women, I absolutely saw really substantial and powerful shifts in how the enforcement of normative white sexuality generated so much power for law enforcement. And we need to attend to the specific histories and the specific experiences, contemporary experiences today, to understand the distinct ways in which these practices developed or manifested in the experiences of Asian women today.
Thank you. I'm going to combine another two questions, which I think hopefully will respond to a couple of things as we near the end here. The time went so fast between this. So Antonia asked us some examples from history or the present that give you hope that these compounding forms of violence can be disrupted. Your title, for instance, suggests a commitment to embodied protest, but I'd love to hear you speak broadly or specifically as you'd like about our political possibilities. And building on that, another question specifically asked about organized responses that you see among criminalized women that are responding to power, which I think is something that would give us hope, right? If we see this kind of organizing resistance to tradition, and noting that there's a lot of ongoing debates that I'm sure we're all familiar with here about reform versus abolition and the meanings or horizons of each, and having a curiosity about how or whether the women that you write about specifically give us a longer history of these sorts of debates and this sort of organizing. So the hope, and what does that resistance look like? Going back to that first kind of inclination I got you on this book is seeing what organizers had done, this history of sex workers uniting. So, yeah.
Yes. And like I said, I was committed to exposing police practices, but so much of that came from the visionary activist knowledge, particularly of Black feminists on the ground, right, who are narrating this, and the Black press as well, right? So I have a chapter which is so indebted to Emily Thuma's work, looking at the competing responses, feminist responses to this massive buildup of police power in the 1980s and 1990s. And what I learned, right, is that in this moment, Black feminist organizers like Margaret Prescott, Barbara Smith of the Combahee River Collective, Gloria Lockett of Coyote, and CalPEP, or the California Prostitution Education Project, they are fully recognizing and naming that the criminalization of commercial sex and sexual policing itself is generating enormous amounts of violence in Black women's lives, both state and non-state violence. And they are naming in particular, so Margaret Prescott, one of the activists I spotlight in this chapter, is theorizing and understanding defund before defund was even, right? Decades before we're talking about defund now, right? This was already in the 1980s. Margaret Prescott was identifying, take the money, right, during this, in her protest against Reaganomics and how Reaganomics actually produces more violence against sexually profiled women. She's saying, take the money from all this law enforcement, these bloated budgets, right, which were nothing at the time compared to the billion-dollar budgets that we see now. Take this money for law enforcement against targeting women and give it to social programming that will disproportionately help and heal Black communities by centering Black women and children. So we see defund in the 1980s already happening on the ground, and that chapter really locates this visionary genealogy of Black feminist thought and activism, protesting police violence by specifically calling out the violence of sex policing. And so what gives me hope today, right, is the organizing that's continuing on, carrying on that flame, right? Whether it's Women with a Vision in New Orleans or Incite Women of Color Against Violence, we're seeing holding up, right? The naming of the distinct forms of violence that proliferate through sexual policing, and the strategies, right, to unmake that violence, particularly through redistributing resources away from law enforcement and toward communities. And I think I'll just close with, there's so much momentum around decriminalization of sex laws, prostitution-related misdemeanors. We've seen some of that work already happening in New York, and that's maybe happening in California. There's a bill waiting on for the governor's signature to decriminalize loitering prostitution laws. So, there's a lot of momentum around decriminalizing sex laws. And that's an important step. It's an important first step, but it's not the only step. The criminalization of prostitution means the criminalization of all people who identify as women. We need to understand how fundamental it is in our lives. Just to go back to the start of our conversation today, right? Prostitution policing is a form of enforcement, normative, white dominated, right, gender and sexual practices. Whether you experience this kind of sexual enforcement on a daily basis, or whether it's simply invisible in your everyday life, the existence of prostitution related laws exists to regulate and police your own behaviors and practices, right? So yes, we need to decriminalize these laws because they do harm and violence to vulnerable people, particularly cis and trans women of color. But we also need to repeal these laws and deny police authority over women's bodies, because we are committed to decriminalizing gender and womanhood itself, right? Because we are committed to decriminalizing the regulation of presumed normative gender and sexual expressions, particularly for women, for people who identify as women.
Thank you. I think that's a really powerful way to end and close. Thank you so much for conversing with me today. Thank you everyone for these wonderful questions. I saw we had one that we didn't get to that was in there, just about any details or stories that were left out from the book or the draft that didn't make it into the book. So if you want to type that in as there's a close here, but I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, thank you both so much for this conversation today. I know I definitely learned a lot and have a new perspective on all of this, so that's wonderful. And thank you to all of our audience out there for spending your afternoon with us. And please learn more about this incredible book and purchase your copy of The Street Belongs to Us at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy your weekend, keep reading, and stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Treva. Appreciate it.